While connected technology is essential for unlocking new efficiencies on the production floor, it's also presented hackers with new opportunities to steal valuable IP and data. To support OT professionals in their battle with cyber criminals, we launched the Security Breach podcast. In each of our over 100 episodes, we've brought in cybersecurity specialists to provide valuable insights and break down critical topics. As a go-to podcast for our listeners, we want to help you align your brand with our expertise. By sponsoring our podcast, your brand will build trust and your message will stand out to an audience searching for tools to assist their cybersecurity efforts. Secure your share in this rapidly growing segment by sponsoring Security Breach. Contact us today to learn more. Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. You know, it struck me in putting this episode together that working in industrial cybersecurity is kind of like playing special teams in football. Regardless of how many times you do something right, all it takes is that one blocked kick or long return to get you noticed in the wrong way. All the instances of flawless defense and precise execution is negated with one single lapse that brings the whole operation down. Well, today's guest offers some insight on how we can build on those wins and ensuring the disruptions are minimized. It was my pleasure to spend some time with Richard Springer, Senior Director of Marketing for OT Solutions at Fortinet. So, Richard, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today and welcome to Security Breach.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. Really appreciate it. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. You know, had a chance to attend the Fortinet conference over in Michigan a couple weeks ago. A lot of great information out there and a lot of stuff, especially talking about some of the new threats that the industrial sector is facing. From your perspective, Richard, where are some of the biggest things coming from? What's sort of lighting up your radar right now?
Yeah, so the what stands out first is ransomware, specifically targeting manufacturing, and not only that, but the U.S. is the biggest regional target on top of that. So things shifted a couple of years ago when the bad actors figured out how to monetize production interruption or impacts the supply chain, what have you. Is that changed the focus to really prey upon manufacturing. And so that continues to this day. For the fifth year in a row, manufacturing is the number one ransom target. So I call these attacks from the north, right? I mean, this largely starts in the IT side, and then it can cross over into the OT network, or there's an indirect impact from processes or other types of solutions that have an impact into the production environment. So at the end of then we see the line stop, quite honestly. And that again is the added unfortunate effect of a ransomware event, but then they're monetizing that production on top of it. So there's that. And that unfortunately, has been going on for quite some time. And, our customers continue to really elevate the OT risk. And so now it's been validated. They're investing towards it. And, but they're starting with the basics: visibility, segmentation, secure remote access. So it's taking some time, to really ramp up, where the IT bad actors have been in the sophisticated enterprise world for numerous years, right? So there's a little maturity imbalance there. So there's that. And then we also have a very select but very capable nation state level of activity looking at really OT protocol-based type of malware. Now, they're using the same access techniques. They're using some different techniques in the OT environment to kind of sit and wait. And so that sit and wait could be for the reasons of collecting intellectual property, trade secrets, what have you. They could be waiting for some event, whether that be politically motivated or whether that be, for other nefarious reasons. Or they're going in there just to demonstrate their capability. So these are not often headline grabbing types of things, but they do make the second or third page. And so there's a lot of different reasons in there, but that last piece of it is, again, they're sophisticated, they're well armed, well funded. There's a mission involved there, and then they're very good. So you've got to defend from the north, and then you've also got to protect that OT network from sophisticated bad actors.
Yeah. Lots to unpack there. I'm going to circle back on a couple of things you mentioned I thought were pretty
Yeah.
interesting. One of the things, though, I think that we really struggle with, especially with ransomware in the industrial sector, is the response. I
Yeah.
mean, there's a lot of different things going on there in terms of responding to get your data back, to kick them out of the system. And then there's always the conversation about whether or not you pay the ransom. From a
Right.
response perspective, Richard, what are you seeing as sort of some of the biggest challenges or some of the biggest things that maybe we need to get a lot better at? We're doing wrong right now.
Yeah, this is an interesting inflection point. I mean, a couple of years ago, it was like, oh boy, I hope this ransom thing isn't going to impact OT. And now it's smack dab in the middle of it, right? Well, we're
Yeah.
still trying to do the basics. So I think the shift that I've seen now is the assumption of an event, as opposed to maybe denial or thinking we could defend against all attacks. So now you move into resilience, you get into restore, recover. And again, these are not profound plans, but what the difference between success and failure is that if you're actually practicing those, and then you're actually using cross-functional teams to exercise your plan and just to test it. So again, if there's an indirect attack from the IT side that's impacting the OT side, you may not know. It may be from procurement. It may be from labeling. It may be from, somebody else in a different organization that's not part of the operational, direct operational team. So that's the assumption is that it will happen. And then it's a matter of like how quickly can you react and recover and get back up and running. Um, I mean, I'm not going to get into the ransom payment piece of it. I mean, that's a business decision and sometimes, a law-abiding decision. But there's also for public companies, you've got to report a material event, to the SEC, and so this is, these are high stakes, right? So I don't mean to, make fun of really any of this, but I think to directly answer your question is make the assumption that it's going to happen. And then as you're unplugging and rebuilding, like how quickly are you getting the line back up and moving? And the last thing I'll add to this, and we've seen this with some of the major manufacturers, is that you as a major manufacturer are a big part of the supply chain, but you are also dependent upon the supply chain below you, right? So if you have these, hyper efficient, just in time, lean, programs in place, you're trying to optimize your supply chain to the nanosecond. And so if they get impacted, what's that impacted to you? So not only are you concerned about your own environment, we now need to evolve into how reliant am I upon key supply chain factors, which I've dealt with, logistically, but now you need to put the cyber lens on top of that.
Yeah. I want to dive a little bit more into supply chains in a bit here, but first circling back to some of the other comments you made too about some of these attacks winding up on page 2 or 3 of the reporting as opposed to getting maybe a little bit more attention.
Mhm.
I think that's a challenge the industry faces a little bit. We don't want to turn the bad guys, we don't want to turn the hackers into comic book characters or anything like that or blow it out of proportion. But it feels like there needs to be a little bit more dialogue about some of these attacks, at least within the industry. And I think that's something we
Yeah.
struggle with a little bit. What's been your take on that? I know Fortinet has a research arm. I know you guys are very deeply involved in a lot of threat detection and threat analysis, but where could the industry do a little bit better, or just manufacturers do a little bit better in sort of sharing some of this information so we can shore up defenses a little better?
Yeah, that's a great question because it's raising the common denominator of whether that's awareness or threat intelligence or actually what are the best practices, security practices, and then within that scope is regulation. Um, and we run our own survey, and we're just coming out here in the next week about the 2026 State of OT and Cybersecurity report. But in one of those results is looking at anticipating regulations. And so we saw from last year that window has shortened. So a lot more, this is 700 global OT operators see that window shrinking, that it's coming. Because without it, there's just too much selectability about your security piece of it. And, as in the bell curve of cybersecurity for OT, it's largely left leaning on the immature side. But there are very advanced, companies out there who have really embraced it. Again, it goes to the acceptance of the OT risk. Usually involves, again, our report shows the elevation to the C-suite, and with that, you get the funding and the resources to go off and do something profound. Um, Additionally, since it's fallen into the CISO, typically the IT teams now are more engaged or even engaged where they weren't before. So that can, that can cause some folded arms in the room, as IT teams and OT teams are staring at each other. But, one of the, best moves I've seen is just from a business card standpoint that they're not IT and OT anymore. They're the security team, right? And so there's some learning to go on between what's operations, and then what are tried and true security practices. Um, so what I mean, I'm getting to a long and elaborate piece of it is that there, in lieu of regulations, companies have to make a risk decision. And they make risk decisions in all of the capacities. And cyber has finally moved up to one of the key decision points. So, you know, I we looked from Fortinet to be the trusted OT advisor, right? And you mentioned FortiGuard Labs. We do have OT threat intelligence. We have an OT security service. We are, the biggest player in OT cybersecurity in the world. And with that, we have a global view, whether it comes down to country or in this case in the states or province or what have you, about different standards, right? So we're continually moving with the planet as OT threats are coming across. And so we can give a holistic view. And I would also say, get part of trade organizations and also open up your radar envelope. Yes, you're in manufacturing, but it doesn't mean you can't learn something from water and wastewater. It doesn't mean you can't learn something from transportation. And so to see that, that wider angle will take some courage to go outside of your realm, right? But sitting back and looking looking down at the Coliseum floor of OT cybersecurity, that it's kind of an 80-20, if not 90-10, as far as the solutions that are necessary. Yes, the environments are different, but the concepts, and again, this goes to high-level architectures like the Purdue model, or it goes into IEC 62443, very detailed zones and conduits type of model, is that we're here to help each individual along their path. But there are a lot of common best practices. And again, I came from the NERC world and North American utilities, and I've seen what a 20-year compliance/regulatory program looks like. We're not going to do that in a day, and we don't need to do that, but something is going to happen. And we saw some of this in reaction to some of the events in the US. So sorry, long answer there, but it's like get going, spend some money, find good vendors out there to have a not only tactical capability but a strategic view, and then again we can offer a global perspective to help make sure that we're coupling together the best practices.
Well, and one of the things I'm glad you brought up is some of these different industries. Manufacturing can learn from them. These industrial control systems that are used, and whether it's a utility, wastewater treatment plant, even some of the logistics providers, it's very similar to the stuff that's used on a plant floor. And we've learned, again, one of the things you mentioned as well was some of these nation state hackers going out, they're probing some of these different systems, and almost by accident, they're figuring out how to weave into some of these small to medium-sized manufacturers as well. They're sort of side targets, if you will, almost by accident. We learned that from a lot of stuff that's going on in Iran. So again, sharing this information, critical to your point.
Yeah. And and I will just say that there are, the information sharing agencies, the ISACs, I mean, and they are, industry focused and that type of thing. I mean, that's another great avenue, in order to get together. But again, at times you need to step back and make sure that you're getting a temperature of water elsewhere as well.
Yeah. We talk a ton too about the IT and the OT silos starting to break down, which is great to hear. If you're talking about just being part of a security team as opposed to sort of being divided amongst those two areas of the enterprise, that's encouraging. We know it's still an ongoing problem for a lot of folks, though, in terms of getting everybody to work together.
Right.
The other thing I wanted to mention too, when you talk about supply chains and a lot of the certifications that are going on right now, I've always felt like as the supply chains start to become more aware of increasing or upgrading the cybersecurity levels of their partners, that should help with a lot of these compliance levels. CMMC is one of the big ones that everybody's talking about. And I would think if you're an automotive supplier, tier 2, tier 3, and you haven't thought about these things before, the GMs and the Fords of the world hopefully are starting to look at their supply chains and saying, hey guys, you got to step up your game a little bit. And in process, that should help with some of these compliance and regulatory efforts as well. Is that kind of what you're seeing as well, or what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, and this is, when you talk about, the big auto manufacturers and so forth, there's a lot of influence there, right? And we've seen this also in oil and gas and those types of things that you can get together, groups of people under a common mission to help, again, raise that common denominator security. And so from that, I mean, there is a, kind of a benign way of developing up what are going to be the best practices. And then that probably is going to go into some procurement process. So then it becomes a competitive advantage to be ahead on the cybersecurity thing. And so that's a lot of, like, again, company to company and maybe organization to organization, trade organization. But the other aspect of this, and it's indirect, is around the cyber insurance piece of it, right? So cyber insurance has a long, interesting story of which I've, again, being up in the Coliseum stairs, not, but what I have seen is the scope change, the premiums change, but then also the underwriting piece of it, where it was maybe a post-it note and a checkbox saying you had OT cybersecurity, and now it's a 40-page PhD dissertation, and then they want to talk about your roadmap, right? So then they may deny your policy anyway, right? So that's, to me, those are two examples about how we can organically get out of this, but those are typically slow moving, right? So still the right way to do it. And again, there's no magic wand on the regulatory side of it. But yeah, certainly getting together these groups of best practices and then putting it together in some type of standard, if you will, that again is just issued as a best practice. And we see these, we have announcements from CISA, we have announcements from a lot of other groups, and then globally there are best practices. So it can be, again, fairly benign, but in that supply chain piece of it, it could be looked at competitively as well. So another reason to advance the investment to be more secure than your competitor.
No, absolutely. I think this is a situation, even though it demands a lot of time, which in manufacturing we never have enough of, even though there's a resource allocation issue, because as you alluded to, this isn't going to happen overnight. This is a situation, in my opinion, where the rising tide lifts all boats. As we all get better and we're forced to get better, it makes the hacker's job that much more difficult, and hopefully we can avoid a lot of these ransomware attacks, denial of service attacks, and other things that just crush the industrial sector and cost us a ton of time and money. So
that's right. Yeah, and while we're defending against the hooded cyber bad actor out there, I do take an opportunity to look at cyber as an enabler for operation reliability. So how many times have we had operators do something unintentionally? We've had few instances of an operator having a bad day and doing something intentionally. So this goes back to access and controls, and cybersecurity can bring that, right? So to be able to remove parameter changes, the ability to remove read-write capabilities, who is there, what communication protocol are they using, and these are all go to keeping the line running strong, right? And it provides cyber hygiene on top of it. So that's, again, there are those unicorns out there that are operators and cybersecurity engineers, and to be able to couple both of those things together is really the win-win. And that's the other thing, that this isn't about just having to spend a bunch of money and then making it tough, for the operators. It's actually, optimizing their environment as well.
One of the things that we've been talking about a lot lately here on Security Breach is this whole continuous improvement dynamic. It's something manufacturers are very well acquainted with and understand. Right. It's ingrained in their DNA. Applying those same principles to cybersecurity makes a ton of sense. And it's also something from a cultural perspective and operational perspective that people should be able to grab onto and really feel a bigger part of, because that's what we're looking towards, getting better all the time.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, that left-leaning bell curve on the immature, the what I'll call the beginning steps. I mean, there is a whole trajectory that's very well mapped out as far as what maturity looks like. And if I put at the end of that an OT SOC or OT SecOps, and whether that's combined with IT or OT, but it's a bit distant out there, right? So you talk about continuous improvement, and that's where what you're doing from a security standpoint, and I mentioned being tactical to strategic, is that you are doing so additive things from a security standpoint that are building towards that OT SOC. And again, you are building operational reliance, resiliency at the same time. So yeah, continuous improvement, right? I mean, that is part of cybersecurity, and we talk about it as maturity, but you're also opening up that scope to go from just segmenting the factory to zero trust for OT to that SecOps piece of it. And then, we'll get to a world again, we haven't even said AI yet, so I'm breaking the seal on it, but we know operationally that's already well underway. We know from a security operations standpoint, it's well underway, but we know in OT that from a cyber standpoint, as far as playbooks and full automation, and we just sit back and drink our coffee, that there's going to be an operational bright line in there that is like, okay, you can automate up to this level, and then you're going to hand it over to the operators, right? So while we're talking about maturity and tactical to strategic, we still have to sit down and look at the operations and make sure that we're making finite decisions that don't have unintended consequences as we're trying to automate and be hyper efficient.
Well, when you talk about the unintended consequences, I mean, that's a perfect segue into talking about artificial intelligence. We
Sure.
know the bad guys are using AI to basically make their attacks happen faster, greater scale, all of those things. We know there's a lot of ways that the good guys, how we can use AI as well in our defenses. So let's
Mhm.
get your thoughts on maybe on some of the places to start, but then also sort of the right speed or the right pace for that integration, because I think some enterprises just dive in full force with the best of intentions, but then sort of get buried and really create some of their own struggles potentially with
Yeah.
trying to use AI.
Oh boy.
That could be the whole podcast, right? Yeah, I know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm trying to look into my AI crystal ball, and it's really cloudy.
Uh,
And if I had a one succinct answer with that, I would probably be sitting on top of a gold
right.
throne somewhere. But I would say this is that I've been in the operational field and manufacturing field for a long time, and AI has been a big part of our livelihood for 10, 20 years, right? So now we're getting into the generative and the agentic, and these more advanced things, and that is running us up almost this exponential curve of capability and also, unintended consequences. So operationally wise, I can't really say anything more than like, just I mean, embrace it, and optimize it. And then, so that's really kind of a non-answer. But from a cyber standpoint, we, from a Fortinet um, standpoint, have been using AI machine learning to diagnose and assess all the data points that we get from our global infrastructure, which is the largest, install base in the world. And so, again, the AI piece of it has been part of this process to generating solutions near real time. Now, getting into what we'll call the Gen AI piece of it, fortunately, security companies like ourselves are well funded, right? I mean, let alone you know, the miracles of Wall Street that are the AI companies, but we're well funded, well positioned to bring in these tools and rapidly adopt them, while behind us in the bow wave are the bad actors, so we're kind of a step ahead. So then it's a matter of, specific to your question about OT, is that, to bring in an OT assistant or a generative AI assistant to be able to have vision into the OT spaces and speak those languages and understand those devices, and then to accelerate that lone or maybe not even resourced OT, SOC specialist, is that is going to rapidly enhance that person's ability to prioritize and effectively deal with high priority, threats. Because we, especially in OT, because we're bringing all these new solutions in, there's just complete this signal and alert overload going on there. So it's almost beyond, human capability to really process all of that. So you need an AI tool to, go through that and then accelerate your ability to contextually sit back and just talk to, a bot in order to bring you through to prosecute that high severity or this really anomalous behavior that's going on in the network. So the I think that this is like, when is the time to do it? Well, yesterday. Um, and then there will be the conversations about that bright line about automating things. But typically, what needs to happen are pretty standard playbooks and largely network based. But you got to be careful. So, same thing. You've already embraced the operational AI piece of it because it's making you more competitive, more profitable. And I already talked about how cyber can be a operational advantage. So look at it that way as well, right? So embrace it and then be really leery of, is this going to, could this lead to an operational impact? So I don't think we're there yet. There's plenty of runway before we'll get to that point.
Well, absolutely. And I think there's everything you mentioned makes a ton of sense, but there's also some very basic ways you can use AI. We've heard about folks just using it to get the asset inventory,
Yeah,
understanding everything that you've got
yeah,
out there to defend, helping
right.
to, helping to prioritize what your crown jewels are, or define what those crown jewels are in establishing priorities. So it
Yep.
doesn't have to be as in depth, maybe, as some folks think. Start with the basics and go from there.
Yeah, and some of what I describe is, kind of, colonizing Mars, right? I mean, but
Yeah.
just as you mentioned, I mean, the biggest concern and the biggest glaring use case is our unpatched OT devices in the factory, right? 20, 30, maybe 40 years old, running like a hose, and that's what they're designed to do. They were never designed to be on the internet, and they were never designed for security. So if you all these glamorous things about automating and optimizing that SOC operator, there are just basic things that need to be done in around compensating controls for that device, right? That vendor may be out of business. Those vulnerabilities will never be patched. So what can I do around that? And that's where if we take all of that signal and alert overload and we sit back and look at, okay, what's our priority line and what are these devices and what are the vulnerabilities around that? So then you're getting very selective. And that is going to give you shorter scope in order to actually make something done effectively. And when I say make something done, it could be you're segmenting, micro-segmentation. You could be putting network detection types of devices on there to see anomalies. Secure remote access, who's getting access to that device. And then what we have is virtual patching, which is automated, and that just puts a security policy basically right on top of that device in order to protect from a specific malware. So there are a lot of compensating controls to build these kind of concentric walls around that vulnerable OT device while we wait for a patch, or maybe it doesn't, but we've mitigated risk. Um, and then we also have to build the SOC.
Well, that's an interesting. We haven't had a lot of conversations about patching and AI and working together to
Yeah,
solve, because patching, as you alluded to, huge challenge
sure.
in the OT environment. But obviously using AI to establish those priorities and sort of put together some best practices for patching, that seems like just a slam dunk. That seems like a great application for the technology there.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're digesting this internally as taking, you know, I represent the OT security platform. I mean, and this is a little bit of infomercial, but I mean, it's 20 plus solutions going from that next generation firewall being the FortiGate to our own OT SecOps tools, right? So if you can take a platform like that and then you can um, pull together network information as well as the log information, as well as the vulnerability information, as well as where that device is located in the network, you can help customers guide them on their prioritization journey that is just right now left to them, right? So certainly, and then AI again would help accelerate that capability. So that's I'm I'm excited for all these AI tools, but then I'm also looking for the next rev and other OT influencers are also talking about the operational, the digital operational network and that overlap into the cybersecurity network, right? So that's going to be interesting, and that's coming quickly, but that's going to be interesting leveraging of the two different data sets for the same mission of keeping the line going, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
One of the things I like to talk about too, Richard, is the biggest vulnerability in any enterprise is the people. And it's not intentional, it's just the
Right.
way it is. And a lot of cybersecurity and how it relates to helping these folks deal with this new level, these new threats that are always emerging, is really the culture of the organization. Fortinet and yourself, you work with a lot of different enterprises and a lot of different scopes in the industrial sector. What have you seen in terms of from a cultural perspective that has allowed some organizations to maybe be a little better at cybersecurity than some of their competitors or some of the other folks out there?
Yeah, and I mean, I've been around for a little bit, and I can say even outside of Fortinet, I mean, previously was just the acknowledgement of the cyber risk, and we've kind of passed that, but there was heavy denial around like, why is this an issue, right? So now I mentioned about CISOs embracing OT risk, right? So that's still happening. That's not with every company. So that OT risk thing, if it's number six in the top five on the risk register, and then it's just sitting on the back, well, this is where some thought leadership and then also global kind of OT threat intelligence would help maybe tip that scale into that top five. So there's still that acceptance that OT of risk validation, right? Um, then, as I talked about IT and OT teams, um, you can hand them a mission, but they don't believe it, right? And so that's
Yeah.
where again getting those two teams together and having the prioritization conversation and seeing how they're different, but then at the end of it, best case is that they all nod their head. They're like, yeah, we need to keep the lights on, we need to keep the line going, right? So we do have a shared mission. Um, so that's the culture piece of it. And then the last part of it, again, with the operators who are going to probably be the most reluctant because change is coming their way, is again translating the cybersecurity solutions or concepts into what is that from an operational standpoint. And we talked previously about, unfortunately, we had an operator do X, Y, and Z. Well, wouldn't it be great if we could keep operator A from doing X, Y, and most of Z? And we can do that from a cyber standpoint, and we don't have to take the line down. How'd you like that? So it's like, oh, well, that sounds great. I said it before, but culturally, it's the IT teams, the OT teams, it's the combined mission, and it's really win-win scenarios, right? And if you could take the whole patching piece of it, of which that the OT operator and the plant manager is like, oh my God, please don't talk to me about patching, right? It's like, well, hey, how about we do some micro-segmentation? How about we give you secure remote access? How about we do, all these different types of
Yeah.
things to make that as least likely as possible, and you haven't had to touch, that device. That sounds great.
So,
Right?
yeah.
So win-wins.
No, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
One of the things too I know Fortinet gets into, and it's a huge issue right now, is for whether it's IT, OT, wherever within the enterprise, is edge and cloud and securing
Mm.
both of those. SASE is a huge topic right now, just because there's so much data flying around out there.
Yeah.
It's connected in way more ways, as you alluded to before, than it was ever meant to. And then there's also the internet that can go as a door that swings both ways. So there's a lot of
Right.
different challenges out there with those two areas. Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the things that you're seeing and also what Fortinet is doing to kind of help in these two areas.
Yeah, and so if the mothership is the enterprise security provider, and whereas my OT security platform has 20 plus solutions, we have 60 plus in our security fabric. And the OT platform is an extension of that, so there's actually convergence out of the box, and we can talk about that maybe some other time. But Fortinet is front and center in cloud security and a SASE provider. I mean, we have our own points of presence as well. And so you didn't mention data sovereignty, which is starting to blossom kind of around the world as well. But we do have, all those solutions available in order to provide the various access points, right? Whether that be endpoint, whether that be cloud. And then if I go back again to OT, I mean, we still heavily focus on-prem, right? It may be an old archaic model, but that's still how OT operates, right? So fortunately, we have those solutions in our portfolio. And then again, even with SASE, we can provide that service ourselves, or whether it's our hosted situations as well. And then if I talk about the convergence piece of it, I'm interested to see how this evolves with manufacturers and with third parties, with the automation control vendors or industrial control vendors. There's, obviously a contractual agreement that goes on there. The managed security providers that are going to have to fill in the voids of not having enough OT security folks, they are going to need access into that factory, right? And they're going to need to, log on to the engineering workstation. They're going to need to manipulate and modify things. So it's going to be interesting to me to see how that level of activity for OT is also interwoven with these, connectivity points, because unfortunately, where we are with OT, a lot of those outside connections are pretty blind. So anyway, there's a lot going on in that space, especially, as OT again coming into it as a new player.
Well, I think the conversation's important because I think there is a misnomer for a lot of manufacturers who think, okay, it's in the cloud. My cloud provider's taking care of that. They've got that secured. Google, Microsoft, whoever you're working with. And that is not the case. Again, that door swings both ways. You need to be taking steps to make sure everything is safe and secure. We're managing access like you alluded to before.
Yeah, I rarely promote podcasts, and I'm not going to promote any one, but I would say anybody who is under that belief should get into an InfoSec podcast and realize um, how easily that can be misconfigured and how easily that can be um, obtained, right? I mean, and I'm not blaming either one of them. It's a sophisticated, managing all that data on the cloud. There's a lot of sophistication that goes into that on both sides. And if it's not done right, then they get exposed, and all of a sudden that data is now available to the bad actors, right? So that's, now I'm way over my OT skis in this regards, but I am privy to that, right? So now, you know, you as I mentioned, the OT world becoming immersed to that. Again, go back to our intellectual property, our trade secrets, our secret recipes, and those types of things. Like there's a tremendous amount of risk into that. There's tremendous amount of advantage to that as well. So again, those both are going to have to be weighed, and we're just right at the early days, quite honestly, in having those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. But good ones to have. Definitely when you think about when we started this podcast in 2022, that conversation is elevated quite a bit, as have a lot of things. So, Richard, this has been fantastic. Just kind of wrapping things up a little bit. Question I like to ask everybody who comes on the show. When you look down the road a little bit, what are some of the bigger trends that we should be aware of maybe 12, 18 months out?
I would, you know, AI, you mentioned SASE, you mentioned all these futuristic, we talked about SOC, and we talked about all these futuristic things. There's going to be a lot more noise in the system. Again, the AI adoption with the bad actors is accelerating their capability. And again, with manufacturing being front and center with that, like it's going to be tough. But do not lose sight of making sure that you're doing the basics. Um, Talk about the human, continue to train the human. You need your visibility, you need your segmentation, you need your remote access, and you can build in aspects of zero trust into that environment. You got to get those level set, because the bad actor's little brother is playing around with OT right now, and all of a sudden, the seasoned individual is going to be turning their sights. So if you don't have the basics in place right now, you're going to be exposed, right? So do the basics. Again, follow that maturity curve. It's well mapped, and anybody IT or OT would say, "Yep, that's what we should be doing." Is move through those, and then in parallel, bring on the AI, the AI assistants and so forth to help accelerate that piece of it. And then you really have to be focused on threat intelligence. That's going to open up a lot. And then it's also what we call near real time. So as we see things emerge, we build that signature, we feed it back into security, and now you're guarding against it. If you're not, part of that construct, then you are time stamped in your ability to defend yourself, right? So make sure that the threat intel feed is cycling in the background to bring solutions back in near real time, because that's just how quickly the bad actors are moving right now.
Absolutely. And first of all, I love when you talk about the basics because that way I'm not the only guy preaching about blocking and tackling. It's the most unsexy possible answer, but it's one of the most important, especially for manufacturing, how heavily it continues to be targeted and
Yeah.
unfortunately successfully targeted by the hackers.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, no doubt. It's yeah, I being a mechanical engineer, I look at it a little more knuckle dragging, but you know what? You got to do that.
yeah.
Got to do that before you're launch the spaceships to Mars. So
Absolutely. So, Richard, one last question I got for you. We've been talking about a lot of the challenges, a lot of the obstacles, a lot of the problems that we have with cybersecurity and the OT environment. But what helps you get to sleep at night, literally? When you think about cybersecurity, there's a lot of stuff we can dwell on that could keep people tossing
sure.
and turning all night. What
Yeah.
gives you some respite, some peace of mind when you close your eyes that we'll be okay?
Um, there's one again, we've gotten out of the phase of denial, right? And I've been in that realm. I mean, I've said banging the desk about OT cybersecurity, and I get this look back like, what's OT? Um, so so having exited that helps me. And then seeing that there is that left-leaning bell curve is moving more central, right? So the investment is going on and that's coming around. And if I go back to my report, there's even some indicators there that maturity is starting to come in the OT realm. I'm not uh, any fantasies about regulations is not helping me sleep at night. So, and the AI too. I mean, being part of a security company, just seeing how rapidly we're evolving and bringing new features and new capabilities is that I still believe we're one step ahead. And then I do look that eventually that there will be more kind of a global embrace as far as like defending critical infrastructure, of which is manufacturing as a category, right? So I do see that, like, and maybe this means from a government standpoint that they're being more leaning forward and going after the worst of the bad actors, right? And so so there are pieces on the chessboard, they're all moving in the right direction. And then yeah, I just feel like there is a momentum change and we're doing effective things right now. Whereas, maybe even 2 years ago, it was still very conceptual. It's like, we'll contemplate about doing something, but I see people with boots on the ground doing it right now. And then we do have success stories coming from our customers. I mean, and I always dig a little deeper on the production side of it, and it's there, right? So there are real tangible results from people taking these steps on the cyber side. And yeah, I'm hopefully I come across as being passionate about it, because I still want my water running, I want the electrons flowing, and I still want my goodies being delivered
Yeah.
as well. So I'm a human at the end of the day, and I am encouraged.
Yeah. Well, I think one that's encouraging too is the passion that people like yourself have when we do talk about cybersecurity, and we're keeping the conversation going. I think that's a big part of it. So
Yes.
thank you so much for coming on and being part of that conversation and
Yeah.
helping our audience learn more about some of the ways they can be better at cybersecurity.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Jeff. And I look forward to the next opportunity.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Richard. Thanks, Richard. And to learn more about the work he and his colleagues are up to, you can check them out at Fortinet.com. I'd also like to thank you for joining us today, and to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or MBTmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore in Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@IEN.com. For Richard Springer, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.